Everyone, welcome back to another episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. I am Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. I want to encourage you to subscribe to ATP if you have not done so already. When you do so, make sure and click that notification bell so you don't miss a single upcoming episode of ATP. Also, I want to encourage you to share ATP videos across social media with your friends if you think that they might find these videos helpful. And third and finally, we want to invite everyone to support ATP. As you are so moved, we've provided a PayPal link in the video description below. I also want to say thanks to those who have graciously supported the ministry of ATP. Let's get to the question for this week. Dear Pastor, with the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, I took it upon myself to research Martin Luther. I am a Roman Catholic, and I have no intention of changing faiths. However, in my research, it is quite apparent that Luther got a raw deal from the folks in Rome back then. Luther was excommunicated by the Roman Church and clearly did not excommunicate himself. In light of Vatican II, specifically Lumen Gentium, which expresses some Lutheran positions, such as the priesthood of believers, and the fact that Pope Francis, has reached out to the Lutheran World Federation. Also, as Bishop Barron has made a video stating that things, if they were calmer back then Lutheranism would have just been another community like the Franciscans. In light of all of this, do you think that the Lutheran Church will ever come into full communion with the Roman Catholic Church? Great question. And the short answer is no. In order for Lutherans and Roman Catholics to enter into full communion, then one of two things would have to happen. Either Lutherans would have to give up the Book of Concord, the Lutheran Confession of the Catholic faith, or Rome would have to give up the Council of Trent with its doctrine that it promulgated and with the condemnations of the Lutheran doctrine and its Reformation. Trent and the Lutheran Confessions are diametrically opposed to one another, even down to their understanding of key theological words like grace, faith, and justification. And so without either side giving up their confession and their condemnations of the other side, there's really no middle ground on which Lutherans and Papists can meet in this discussion. Now, as you mentioned, though, that's precisely what's happened among the Lutherans of the Lutheran World Federation, or the LWF. The LWF really consists of liberal Lutherans from around the globe. And quite frankly, the Lutherans of the LWF treat the Lutheran confessions as if they're a family heirloom, rather than a true exhibition of scriptures. To these Lutherans, the confessions are more of a cultural part of Lutheranism, comparable to sauerkraut or potlucks or something like that. And it's this marginalization and this, frankly, despising of the Lutheran confessions that has allowed the LWF to engage in ecumenical discussions with the Vatican for decades now, the ultimate goal of those discussions being full communion. Now, the chief achievement of the Lutheran World Federation is the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification. It was signed in 1999 by representatives from the LWF and from the Vatican. And what the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification claims, well, let's just call it the JDDJ for short, because that's a mouthful. What the JDDJ claimed was to come to a consensus between these two parties on the doctrine of justification. Now, Lutherans teach that justification is the chief article of the Christian faith, that it is the article upon which the church stands or falls. But in this document, these liberal Lutherans have completely given up the doctrine of justification and have embraced ambiguous language and vague phraseology to confess this chief article of the faith. The JDDJ can really only be called a consensus because it's vague. And in some places, the Roman doctrine actually prevails in that document. So the JDDJ is just a consensus in name only. And really, let's be honest, that's all the ecumenical movement can really hope to achieve. Now, while Lutherans of the LWF may one day enter into full communion with the Bishop of Rome, and I frankly wouldn't be surprised if that happens, those Lutherans that actually embrace their confession and treat it as a true exposition of the Scriptures and a true confession of the common Christian faith, they're not going to be in communion with Rome until Rome renounces the doctrine promulgated at Trent, along with the condemnations therein of the scriptural doctrine. Now, you do bring up Vatican II and Lumen Gentium, so I want to talk about that because there is a little bit of confusion about what happened at Vatican II. And some do argue that Vatican II has softened Rome's doctrinal position. The important thing to remember about Vatican II is that it was a pastoral, not a dogmatic council. And so Rome's official doctrine is still the decrees of the Council of Trent, which thoroughly condemned the Augsburg Confession and the Lutheran Reformation. Vatican II didn't change Rome's doctrine in any significant way. It just simply recalibrated how the Roman Church approaches the world. So we see that most of its changes were simply cosmetic. The liturgy is overhauled. That's the most obvious. Common language, the vernacular language, is allowed to be used in the Mass instead of Latin. Lay participation in the Mass is encouraged. But doctrinally, nothing significant changed with Vatican II. And that's something that the LWF just simply doesn't want to admit or address in its talks with the Vatican. Now, one of the most important constitutions to come out of Vatican II was Lumen Gentium, which our viewer mentions. And that constitution outlines, from the papist perspective, what the church is, where the church is found, and who belongs to the church. And one thing that Lumen Gentium did was declare that everyone baptized into Christ, they're priests. Now, as you say here, this appears to be a step towards Lutheran doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, but Rome's version of the priesthood of believers is very different from Luther's and the biblical version. Rome still teaches two distinct priesthoods. The ministerial, or the hierarchical priesthood, is the one that teaches and rules the church and effects the sacrifice of the Mass, whereas the common priesthood, the priesthood of the baptized, in virtue of the royal priesthood, the document says, join in the offering of the Eucharist. They likewise exercise that priesthood in receiving the sacraments, in prayer and thanksgiving, in the witness of a holy life, and by self-denial and active charity. That's in paragraph 10. So both priesthoods derive their authority from Christ, the high priest, and their tasks as well. But as the document says, they differ from one another not only in degree and in essence. Excuse me, I'm misquoting that. But they differ from one another in essence and not only in degree. There we go. So these two priesthoods are two separate entities. Now that's what makes Rome's priesthood of the baptized much different from Luther's. For Luther, there is no need to have a New Testament priesthood resembling that of the Levitical in the Old, because Christ has fulfilled that office. And so it doesn't have to be, it's not necessary for that to be an office in the church. And that's because Luther rejects the idea that the Mass is a re-sacrificing of Christ for the living and for the dead. There's no need to be re-sacrificing Christ. And so rather the Mass exists, from the Lutheran perspective, to bestow the gifts that were won by Christ's once-for-all sacrifice upon the Calvary. So the ministry isn't a priesthood like the Levitical. Now, the big difference then is that Rome maintains this double priesthood, one ministerial and one lay, while Luther taught that all the baptized are priests who offer to God the sacrifice of praise and present their bodies as a living sacrifice, that is, by daily putting to death the flesh and the sins and passions thereof. So while Rome's inclusion of the priesthood of the baptized is a good move, it really doesn't get them any closer to Luther's position, as long as that hierarchical priesthood is still receiving an indelible character by which they effect the sacrifice of the Mass. Now, in other matters throughout Lumen Gentium, we see too that for Rome it's simply business as usual. For instance, in paragraph 8, the church is governed by the successor of Peter and by the bishops in communion with him, which essentially means that the hierarchy is the church. And at the top of that hierarchy is the Pope, who possesses primacy over all other bishops by divine arrangement, not by human arrangement. In fact, it says in paragraph 22, the Pope's power of primacy over all, both pastors and faithful, remains whole and intact. In virtue of his office, that is, as vicar of Christ and pastor of the whole church, the Roman pontiff has full, supreme, and universal power over the church. And so, from all this, it naturally flows that, paragraph 14, whoever, therefore, knowing that the Catholic Church was made necessary by Christ, would refuse to enter or to remain in it, could not be saved. So, for as ecumenical as Rome has become since Vatican II, the unity it seeks is still a unity based on agreement with its own doctrine. And frankly, any unity that comes at the expense of the truth of Scripture isn't a unity worth having. That's why Lutherans who actually hold fast to their confession aren't going to be entering into communion with the Bishop of Rome anytime soon, no matter what the pseudo-Lutherans of the LWF achieve through their concessions. until Rome repents of its falsehoods, there can be no true communion. We'll see you next time on ATP.